The early morning sun spilled across the Masai Mara, casting amber light over the dew-kissed grasslands. A breeze stirred the acacia trees as shadows stretched long across the golden terrain. Beneath a rocky ledge near Angama Ridge, a female leopard lay in silence, her fur dappled with faint scars and the glow of old resilience. Beside her, two small cubs blinked against the light, their spotted coats barely visible against the earth. Not far away, Daniel Hayes adjusted the lens on his camera, unaware that this quiet moment would change his life forever. Daniel was 47, with salt-flecked hair and a face weathered more by grief than age. A professional travel photographer, he had built his career on distant peaks, desert ruins, and polished magazine spreads. But this trip to Kenya was different. He wasn't chasing beauty. He was chasing silence, an antidote to the noise his life had become after the collapse of his marriage and the death of his younger sister, Claire, whose absence echoed through every room of his Vancouver apartment. When the offer came to photograph predator behavior in East Africa for an international publication, he accepted without hesitation, not for the assignment, but for the distance it offered from everything familiar. The first time he saw the leopard, she was perched in the fork of a fever tree just after sunrise, her tail hanging like a lazy pendulum and her green-gold eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't move as he took a few cautious steps forward, camera ready. She only looked at him, not with fear, not with hostility, just awareness. That was enough for Daniel to give her a name, though he kept it to himself, Naledi, meaning star. There was something celestial in the way she moved, something both ancient and solitary. Local rangers confirmed what Daniel suspected. Naledi had lost her mate to a lion ambush weeks earlier. She was now raising 2 cubs alone. In the predator world, that meant long odds. Without the protection of a male or the cooperation of a sisterhood, a single leopard mother had to hunt, defend, and nurture all at once. And yet, each day she returned to the same patch of land, the same tree, the same morning rituals. It was as if the Mara had pressed her into a shape she refused to break from. Daniel respected her from the start. He never intruded. He followed at a respectful distance, using the rocky ledges and thickets as blinds. He documented her life in hundreds of stills, her teaching the cubs how to crouch low, her cautious scans of the horizon before every move, the way she licked behind their ears while they slept. The cubs were still young, their spots dark and defined, their movements clumsy. One seemed bolder than the other, often the first to leave the den, to pounce at rustling leaves or chase grasshoppers. Daniel started calling them the little storm and the shadow, not out loud, just to himself. It wasn't about getting the perfect shot anymore. It was about returning. Each day, Daniel found himself waking up before the sun, hurrying to the ridge with a quiet urgency he hadn't felt in years. He stopped checking emails, stopped uploading daily to his cloud server. Somewhere between the weight of the camera strap on his shoulders and the whispering winds of the Mara, he began to let go. But letting go didn't mean forgetting. At night, in his small canvas tent lit by lantern glow, he would sometimes stare at the folded note in his pocket, Claire's last letter, found in the back of her desk drawer after she passed. It wasn't a farewell. It was a birthday card she never gave him. "I hope you're still taking photos," she wrote in her uneven handwriting. "The world needs someone to slow down and see it." Daniel read those words every few nights, never aloud, and wondered if somehow this leopard, this wild, wounded mother, was giving him what he didn't know he needed. A story not to sell, but to feel. Days blurred into weeks. The dry season deepened, and the earth grew harder beneath his boots. Naledi's hunting became more strategic. She began moving further from the ridge, tracking impalas in the early morning hours. Daniel noticed her becoming more cautious, more deliberate. The cubs were growing, but they still depended on her completely. Once, he captured a frame of her, dragging a young warthog by the neck, the cubs trailing behind her in awkward mimicry. He didn't share that photo with anyone. It felt like trespassing on something sacred. He also noticed the dangers, scars left on the land by human presence. Off-road tire tracks near the marshlands, loud safari jeeps that lingered too close. He once watched a drone buzz overhead, sending a herd of zebras into a panicked gallop. Naledi stayed low that day, ears flattened, waiting for the machines to disappear before emerging again. Daniel wrote in his journal that night, "We come to witness wildness, but leave fingerprints everywhere." It was on the 17th day that he realized the line between observer and participant had begun to blur. He arrived earlier than usual and found Naledi and the cubs already on the move. She had killed something in the night and left the remains beneath the cover of brush. The cubs tugged at the carcass eagerly. Daniel lifted his camera, but didn't take the shot. Instead, he watched. That morning, as the sun broke over the Mara in soft pinks and golds, Naledi turned her head toward him. Just for a moment. Her gaze held no fear, no curiosity. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or simply, acknowledgement. You're still here. And that moment, that silence, meant more to Daniel than any published photograph could. He began spending more time with the guides and rangers, learning the rhythms of the land. They told him about poaching trails, migration shifts, and the territorial maps drawn not on paper, but in scent and instinct. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he captured. And every evening he returned to Naledi. Then came the day she didn't. He waited beneath the tree until long past dusk, scanning every bush, listening for every rustle. No paw prints, no movement. Just silence. His heart thudded louder than his camera's shutter ever had. He told himself she had gone to hunt farther out, told himself not to worry. But worry rooted itself like thorny brush in his chest. The next morning, still no sign. Then a second day. On the third, Daniel woke before sunrise and began walking beyond his usual territory, past the river bend, past the termite mounds. He found her near a thicket of wild euphorbia, limping, a gash on her hind leg, fresh and raw. She had likely been ambushed, perhaps a baboon troop or a male leopard defending his range. The cubs were nearby, alert and frightened, unsure what to do. Daniel froze. The rules of wildlife photography echoed in his mind. Do not intervene. Do not interfere. Do not become part of the ecosystem. But as he looked at the mother leopard, still standing, still watching him through pain-clouded eyes, something deep inside shifted. He took one quiet step back, then another. He didn't raise his camera. Instead, he whispered, "You're still here." And somehow, that felt like enough. The wind had changed. What was once a soft whisper through the tall Savannah grass had become a restless breath, dry and sharp with the scent of dust and heat. The Mara was shifting beneath Daniel's feet, its mood growing heavier with each passing day. The rains had withdrawn early, and the dry season had come with quiet authority. The golden earth began to crack at the edges, and Daniel, who had once moved through the landscape as a guest, now felt its pull deeper with every sunrise. Naledi, the leopard he had followed for nearly a month, was healing, but slowly. The gash on her hind leg no longer bled, but it had formed a tight, angry scab that made her limp after long hunts. Daniel had not spoken to anyone about what he'd seen that day. Her collapse in the grass, the cubs circling nervously, unsure of their mother's silence. He hadn't reported it to the rangers, nor had he contacted the conservancy vet. He had made a choice: to observe, not interfere. But the truth burned under his ribs. He had already crossed the line, not by offering aid, but by caring. Each morning, he returned to the euphorbia thicket. Naledi no longer flinched at his approach. She knew his scent now: dry earth, sweat, and the faint oil of his leather strap. She allowed him to watch her from a safe distance, and her cubs, now larger, bolder, had begun to play near the boundary of his presence, not quite afraid, but not fully trusting either. Daniel noted their behaviors in his journal. The bolder cub, the one he had quietly nicknamed Ash, was daring and impulsive, often climbing low branches or mock pouncing on insects. The quieter one, Ember, was more observant, often staring at Daniel with tilted head, her eyes deep and steady, as though she could see the stories hidden behind his silence. One evening, as the sky burned orange behind the acacias, Daniel caught a rare scene through his lens. Naledi limping forward, her cubs trailing behind, and stopping to demonstrate a hunting crouch. She lowered herself to the earth with deliberate slowness, signaling the cubs to mimic her. They did. Awkward, unsure, their small tails flicking with anticipation. She paused, held her position, then launched forward in a slow, deliberate mock chase. The cubs followed, yipping softly. No kill. No real prey. Just a lesson. Daniel's finger hovered over the shutter, then pressed. Click. 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 But the final photo, Naledi pausing to look back at her cubs with her head high, her shoulders low, her amber eyes glowing with intent, stole something from him. Not just admiration, not awe, something closer to recognition, the way she taught them, through patience, through presence, reminded him of the quiet mornings with his sister Claire on the lake, teaching her how to thread a fishing line, how to wait, or the way he once taught his nephew to balance a camera for the first time, adjusting the focus ring with deliberate, quiet hands. Love, in its most honest form, was never loud. That night, the temperature dropped. Daniel sat outside his tent, camera beside him, journal open. He wrote slowly. She's not just surviving. She's showing them how to live. In her silence, there is instruction. In her presence, protection. In her pain, still, purpose. And I keep photographing because I don't know how else to say. I see you. It wasn't the kind of note he'd ever share, but writing it made the weight inside him shift. The next few days turned cruel. The sun grew harsh, the shade evaporated. Prey grew scarce. Naledi had to travel farther to hunt, and the limp made it harder. Twice Daniel followed from a distance, only to watch her fail. A missed pounce, a startled antelope darting off before she could close the gap. Each failure carved a deeper line into her exhaustion. Her cubs, thin and restless, began to fight over scraps. It wasn't long before the first real threat arrived. On the 5th day of drought, a hyena pack appeared. Daniel spotted them first, their shapes weaving through the golden grass, snouts lifted to catch a scent. He was sitting under a fig tree, a kilometer west of Naledi's den. He could see her, barely, beneath a bush, the cubs curled into her flank. When the hyenas drew closer, A low growl rose from her throat, vibrating the ground around her. She stood, shoulders squared despite her limp. The cubs shrank behind her. Daniel's mouth went dry. He knew the rule. He knew the instinct. Stay out of it. But he felt his camera slipping lower, forgotten against his chest. The lead hyena advanced, slow, calculating. Naledi bared her teeth, and then, with a burst of force that seemed to defy her injury, she lunged. Not to attack, but to distract. Her movement was swift and curved, pulling the attention of the pack toward her. She darted left, then right, pain evident, but her will unbroken. The cubs scattered into the bush, and the hyenas gave chase. What followed was 20 minutes of chaos. Dust, snarls, flashes of golden fur between trees. Daniel tracked it all with shaking hands. He didn't lift his lens. He didn't run. He just stood still, heart thudding in time with the Mara's silence. When it ended, Naledi was alone, bleeding, standing on a rock, her chest rising and falling like bellows. The hyenas had vanished. So had the cubs. Daniel spent the rest of the day searching. No sign, just scattered paw prints, tufts of fur, and broken grass. He returned to Camp Hollow. That night, a storm gathered. Thunder cracked over the horizon, and rain fell hard, breaking the heat. Daniel didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to the downpour on canvas, whispering, "Please, let them be safe." At dawn, he returned to the fig tree. There, beneath its twisted roots, curled tight into their mother's body, were the cubs, shivering, exhausted, alive. Naledi was soaked, blood streaking her foreleg, her sides heaving. But she was licking them both gently, as if to say, "You are still here. So I am still here." Daniel dropped to his knees, and for the first time in years, tears filled his eyes, not from loss, but from sheer, stunned gratitude. That day, he didn't take a single photo. By now, Daniel had stopped thinking of the days in numbers or dates. Life in the Mara no longer ran on deadlines or headlines, but on instinct, breath, and unspoken understanding. The land itself had taught him that. The animals didn't mourn what passed or fear what approached. They simply adapted. They endured. Naledi had adapted too. The wound on her leg had sealed into a stiff scar, and though the limp remained, she moved with sharpened caution. Her muscles leaned into her gait differently, but her will was intact. She had survived the hyenas, the drought, and most of all, the growing pressure of her cubs' hunger. In the span of 2 weeks, they had changed from playful shadows to agile learners. Ash began climbing higher into the trees. Ember had learned to stalk with near-silent grace. Every movement of theirs echoed Naledi's, and Daniel's. He had changed, too, though he wouldn't have recognized it if not for Michael's call. His son's voice crackled through the satellite phone one evening just after sunset. The usual awkwardness passed quickly. Michael was 22 now, studying architecture, and hadn't spoken to his father in more than 6 months. "Still chasing leopards?" Michael asked, half teasing. Daniel looked out across the darkening grasslands before answering. "No," he said quietly. "Not chasing, just staying." There was a long pause. Then Michael said something that surprised him. "I looked at some of your photos, the ones from this trip. You used to photograph animals like landscapes. Now you photograph them like people." Daniel didn't know what to say. He only managed, "Maybe I finally started seeing them for who they are." And maybe that's what hurt the most. Because once you start seeing animals not as subjects, but as souls, there's no going back. The shift came subtly at first. More tourists had arrived. The Mara was in full migration season now. The wildebeests moved in vast numbers, the sky thick with dust. Safari vehicles multiplied across the landscape, their paths weaving like a poorly choreographed ballet of metal and intention. And Naledi, once hidden in secret places, now risked being seen more often. She had to. The prey moved into the open. If she stayed hidden, her cubs would starve. Daniel noticed the first sign of trouble near the salt plains. He was tracking her from a safe distance, watching as she flanked a herd of gazelle. It was a clean approach, low, efficient, textbook. The cubs remained behind. She waited for the right moment, coiled to strike. And then the rev of an engine shattered the quiet. A jeep, white, roofless, tourists leaning out with long lenses and sun hats, roared into the clearing. Not from malice, just ignorance. Naledi froze. The gazelle bolted. The hunt was ruined. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't look at the jeep. She only turned and walked back to the bush, tail low, shoulders heavy with failure. The cubs would go hungry again. Daniel sat in the dust long after the jeep had gone, the weight of guilt pressing into his chest. He wasn't the one who interrupted the hunt, but he had been watching it happen, helpless. That night, he couldn't sleep. He scrolled through his memory card, looking at images that now felt brittle. Beauty no longer felt enough. Documentation no longer felt neutral. If photographers and tourists alike were contributing to the erosion of these wild spaces, then weren't they all accountable? The next morning, he packed his bag and walked straight to the rangers' camp. He didn't come as a journalist. He came as a witness. "I've been watching her," he said. "She's changed how I see everything. But I've also seen the way we move through this place, how we disrupt, distract, dominate. There has to be a better way." The head ranger, an older Kenyan man named Joseph, listened without interruption. Then he simply said, "You've seen what most don't, so now you know the price of witnessing." Together, they drafted a report, an internal proposal advocating for new guidelines on safe viewing distances, noise reduction, and ranger intervention during critical hunting hours. Daniel offered his photos, not for press, but for education. Joseph promised to present them at the next conservancy meeting. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a ripple. Then came the turning point. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, a golden hour hunt. Naledi had been trailing a lone impala along a ridge while the cubs remained hidden. Daniel had taken a position uphill, careful not to be seen. The light was perfect, warm, soft, alive. But just as Naledi moved in, a second jeep appeared. Not a tourist vehicle. This one belonged to a private film crew, unauthorized. Their drone lifted into the air before Daniel could even react. The buzzing shattered the impala's calm. The animal bolted. Naledi gave chase, desperate now, not for sport, but for survival. Daniel ran too, down the ridge, across the gully, lungs burning. He caught up just in time to see her collapse, not from injury, but from sheer exhaustion. Her breath heaved, her body curled over nothing. No meal, no kill. Just another failure. But the cubs had followed her this time. Ash emerged first, nervous, unsure. Then Ember. And Daniel, without thinking, stepped between them and the advancing drone. He waved his arms, shouted up at the sky, "Turn it off!" The drone wavered, then dipped, returning to the jeep. The crew shouted something at him, but he didn't hear it. He was kneeling beside Naledi, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the heat of her pain. She didn't growl, didn't run. She looked at him, and he whispered, "I'm sorry." Later that night, back in camp, Daniel made a decision. He wrote an email to the magazine. "I won't be submitting a feature. I've taken hundreds of photos, but none I want the world to consume unless they understand the cost. If we keep turning these creatures into icons, we forget their mothers, fighters, beings. I came here to take something, but maybe it's time I give something back." He pressed send, and it felt like closing a door and opening another. The next morning, Naledi was gone. Not gone as in vanished, just gone from the ridge. Daniel searched all day, walking further than ever before. His body ached, his boots tore, his water ran low. And then, near the bend of the Talek River, he saw her. Naledi, the cubs, together, eating. A successful hunt, a quiet kill. No interruptions. Daniel didn't raise his camera. He simply sat down in the grass, hidden by the slope, and watched. The light shifted. The earth turned. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel like a photographer at all. He felt like part of the silence. The wind carried whispers of approaching rain. It had been nearly 3 months since Daniel first set foot on the Mara Plains. Time, in the wild, was different. It was carved not by calendar pages, but by growing cubs, healing wounds, and the subtle shift in the air that told of seasons turning. Naledi's cubs no longer trailed behind her like shadows. They flanked her now, alert, confident, leaner with each sunrise. Young predators in their own right. And Daniel, once the foreigner in their world, had somehow become the quiet constant. The photographs he took now were different. There were fewer of them. Not because the moments lacked beauty, but because he had grown to understand that not all beauty demanded to be captured. Some of it was meant only to be experienced. Still, his lens had become a witness to transformation. Ash, the more restless cub, had begun to attempt solo stalks. He was clumsy, overconfident, often startling prey too early. Ember, more calculating, preferred the long wait, the slow crouch in golden grass, the frozen patience of her mother. Together, they mirrored different parts of Naledi's soul. Daniel often found himself wondering what part of himself they reflected back. He had stopped sending his work to the publication. The silence from his editor grew cold, then indifferent. But Daniel no longer cared. He wasn't here for the headlines, not anymore. Instead, he had begun documenting something far less marketable, the quiet consequences of human presence. He noticed patterns, jeeps that idled too close to resting animals, engines left running near waterholes, flashes from amateur photographers startling night creatures. He started collecting these incidents not with his camera, but in notes, time-stamped and dated. He filed a full report with the Mara Conservancy, now in close contact with Joseph, the head ranger. Together they built a presentation for an upcoming conservation summit. Not just photos of leopards, but of interruption, of harm, of noise in a world that needed silence. But even as Daniel poured himself into this mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would ask more of him than observation or advocacy, a test of values, of loyalty. It arrived on the 83rd day. The morning began as most did. Cool breeze, low sun, bird song cascading across the plains. Naledi and her cubs were moving along the edge of the river, where reeds concealed warthogs and young gazelles. Daniel followed at a respectful distance, keeping to the trees. That's when he heard it. A sharp crack, then silence. Not thunder. A gunshot. Daniel froze. He scanned the horizon. At first, nothing. Then movement. 2 figures in camouflaged clothing slipping through the thickets beyond the river bend. One carried a rifle. The other dragged a burlap sack. Poachers. Every cell in Daniel's body ignited. He dropped low, heart pounding, mind racing. Naledi was just ahead of them, unaware. Her cubs close behind. He checked his phone. No signal here. He had no satellite radio on him, no time to fetch the rangers. By the time help arrived, it could be too late. He took a breath, and then he moved. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't reasoned. It was instinct. Daniel circled behind the poachers, staying low, moving fast between bush and rock, avoiding dry twigs and dead grass. He had no weapon, just his camera slung around his shoulder and the adrenaline in his veins. He climbed a small outcrop, raised his camera, and began taking photos. Not of animals, of men, faces, gear, weapon serial numbers, vehicle plates on the far side of the bank. He got everything. And then, with trembling hands, he activated his emergency beacon. A signal would ping the ranger station in under 10 minutes, but the poachers had seen movement. One of them shouted. A shot rang out, not close, but close enough. Daniel ducked and sprinted down the slope, breath clawing at his chest. He didn't run toward camp. He ran toward Naledi, toward danger. She had heard the shot. Her body was already low, alert. The cubs huddled beneath a bush. Daniel burst into the clearing and held his arms out, not at her, but at the brush beyond. "Go!" he shouted, eyes locking with Naledi's. "Take them, and go!" She stared at him. Then, a flick of the tail, a silent decision, she gathered the cubs and vanished into the tall grass, vanishing the way only leopards could, like smoke slipping between trees. The poachers did not follow. By then, the rangers had arrived. Shots were exchanged. The poachers were caught. But Daniel wasn't there to see it. He had collapsed behind the tree line, dizzy and gasping, the weight of everything bearing down at once. He woke in the rangers' camp infirmary, bruised, dehydrated, alive. Joseph sat beside him, holding Daniel's camera. "They got everything," he said, "because of you." Daniel tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "The leopards?" "Safe," Joseph nodded. "We tracked her prints this morning. She's moved them further upstream. Hidden, but close. She knows." Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't ask what she knew. He already felt it. The next day, Daniel stood on the riverbank, weak but standing. The grass was quieter now. The danger had passed. For now. And then, just as the wind shifted again, he saw her. Naledi. On the opposite ridge, watching him. No cubs in sight. Just her. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Daniel felt something unspoken settle between them. Not ownership, not bond, but acknowledgement. A man, a mother, Two beings caught in the crosshairs of a world not made for either of their silences. She blinked, and then she turned away. Daniel didn't raise his camera. That evening, the first drops of rain touched the Mara. The land sighed, soaking it in like a gift. The trees awakened, the soil darkened, and Daniel, exhausted, changed, sat in the open doorway of his canvas tent, watching the sky soften. He didn't write that night. There were no words to contain it, just the knowledge that he had crossed something irreversible. Not just a physical boundary, but a moral one. He had become part of the story. And now, the story was part of him. The Mara had changed, not in the way cities do, not with buildings or new borders, but in its rhythms. The grass whispered differently now, as if aware of the storm that had come and passed. The poachers had been caught. Their prosecution was underway. Daniel's photographs had been submitted as evidence, their clarity undeniable. But the real change had been quieter. Ranger Joseph had taken Daniel's written notes and images to the Conservancy Board. In response, new off-limit zones were drafted. More ranger patrols were funded. A small education program was launched for local guides, centered not around tourism growth, but around respectful observation. And somewhere upstream, Naledi and her cubs continued to live. Daniel hadn't seen them in a week, but he knew they were there, because now he didn't need a lens to believe in their survival. His flight home was scheduled for the following week, not because he wanted to leave, but because it was time. He had stayed longer than intended, longer than planned. He had come to Africa to photograph leopards. He was leaving with something far greater and far heavier. On his last night in the Mara, Daniel packed slowly. His tent looked different now. No longer a temporary place, but something sacred, transformed by memory. The journal on his table was full. The camera batteries were charged but unused. He hadn't taken a single photo since the confrontation at the river. Some moments, he had learned, weren't meant for export. They belonged to the land, to the animals, to silence. He stepped outside just before dusk. The wind was still. The acacias trembled gently in the soft light. And as he walked toward the ridge, the one where he had first seen Naledi, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. A low, familiar growl. Not threatening, just present. He turned, and there she was. Naledi. Her coat shimmered in the low sun, now fuller, her body stronger. Behind her, a flicker of movement, ash and ember, trailing just close enough to be seen. Both nearly grown, their shoulders broad, their eyes sharper. Predators, yes, but also survivors. She watched him from across the clearing, and Daniel knew this was no accident. This was a farewell. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply raised one hand, slowly, palm open, not to wave, but to acknowledge. And for a breathless second, Naledi did something extraordinary. She stepped forward, just once, then turned and disappeared into the bush. Ash and ember followed. Gone, but not lost. Daniel flew back to Oregon beneath a sky so wide it seemed impossible to leave behind. But part of it stayed with him. It clung to his skin, in the dust of his boots, in the creases of his journals, in the silence that lingered behind every shutter click. Back home, the world felt louder. Emails, interviews, invitations. The story of the poaching confrontation had gone viral. Major outlets requested his perspective. A documentary producer reached out. "You're the man who stood between a rifle and a leopard," they said. But Daniel didn't want to be that. He didn't want to be a hero in someone else's headline. So he declined the documentary. He gave his rights to the Conservancy instead. The photographs he had taken of the poachers were used in ranger training sessions across Kenya. His notes were turned into a small field guide for tourists on how to observe wildlife without harm. His prints were exhibited, not in glossy galleries, but in rural schools across the country. And quietly, with no press release, Daniel created a foundation in Naledi's name. The Ember Fund, a small, locally run initiative that funded equipment and salaries for wildlife rangers. One cub's name, Ember, now meant warmth, vigilance, legacy. A year later, Daniel stood in front of a university auditorium. His son, Michael, now a conservation student, had invited him to speak. "I don't have many answers," Daniel began. "But I have one truth. You cannot love what you do not see. And you cannot protect what you do not love. So go. See it. Learn it. Protect it." He didn't show any images. Instead, he passed around a stone. A small one from the Mara riverbed. Smooth, warm to the touch. "This is all I brought home," he said. "This and a story I was never meant to star in. A story that belonged to a leopard and her children." 10 years passed. Life moved the way it always does. Quietly, invisibly. Then all at once, Daniel grew older. His hair silvered. His walks grew slower. He still took photographs, but now mostly of light, trees, lakes, old hands holding new ones. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Kenya. The handwriting was familiar, Joseph's. Inside was a photograph, a female leopard on a ridge, 3 small cubs behind her, and a note. "We believe she is Ember's daughter." Daniel didn't cry. He smiled. Because this, he realized, was how stories survive, not in headlines or hashtags, but in lineage, in generations that walk quietly in their mother's footsteps, in humans who choose no to conquer, but to watch, protect, and let be. On the last page of his final journal, Daniel wrote, "I came to Africa to take photos of wild things, but it was a wild thing who took something from me instead. My ego, my distance, my illusion of separation. And what she left in return was far more valuable. She left belonging. She left humility. She left love." That night, as stars scattered over Oregon like a reflection of the Mara sky, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Naledi." Somewhere, far away, a leopard moved through tall grass, unseen, but not unfelt.